All right. Welcome to the 24th meeting, which is crazy, of the Wharf project. Today, again, more updates. Lots of focus on the website and the contract kit still. Little bits on the session kit as we've been slowly combining functionality between the session kit and the contract kit. We'll get into that in a little bit. Yeah, so I guess to dive straight into things, we'll jump on those updates. Let me get my window up. In terms of projects that are ongoing, the contract kit, we have a bunch of PRs that have been merged this week. We'll jump into those just in a little bit because that'll be the majority of the call itself. The session kit, like I mentioned, has seen some updates. You can kind of track those if you're interested. Right now, we're tracking on this branch for a 1.0 release, and then whenever it's like combining nicely with the contract kit, I think. This week it was a lot of focus on placeholder resolution, which if you're unaware of what that is, the EOSIO signing request protocol has placeholders in it that you can use to template out the data. It is for actors and permissions primarily, authorizations and in transaction data. They're basically integer values of the names that no one would ever be able to use unless they were intentionally injecting, the in64 versions of the names. So they never exist on chain, and we use them as placeholders. And then they get templated out when the transaction is being signed. Generally, the wallet has been doing it, but we are making some changes to the session kit to make the session kit do it in advance, because sessions are bound to individual actors and individual permissions to their specific wallet. And the plugins themselves need placeholder resolution to occur before the plugin can process the transaction at times. So ran into some oddities because the contract kit is now using placeholders. If you use the contract kit to generate an action, the contract kit doesn't know who the actor is going to be in the transaction, and so it uses placeholders to put those in. And now that we've seen that interaction between the contract kit and the session kit, as soon as a plugin tried to interact with a contract kit action, a plugin from the session kit, that name resolution was causing some weirdness. So that's kind of the big update, is now that we have the session kit doing a little bit of pre-resolution of those placeholder values so that the plugins will know what these transactions are supposed to be, and they'll actually be valid when the plugins are working with it. So the kinds of things we're discovering as we finally start working with these two kits together. Shouldn't break anything. We had to update the resource provider plugin. That was actually our test case for all of this, and it was a minor change to do some resolution there. But yeah, these are just the kinds of things that are going on in the session kit as we lead up to a stable release of the contract kit. The website itself has seen a lot of progress. We've added front matter into the documentation and guides section. So now we can control the hiding and showing of information. There's been a lot of content tweaks, a lot of work on the documentation itself. And we are starting to do some proofing and move various chunks of the documentation from a draft state into a proofreading state into kind of a release state. I guess we kind of looked at this in the past, but this is the dark mode of the site and what it currently looks like. We're in a documentation page. We've added things like this. The menu now dynamically loads some of the subheaders so you can jump between sections. It tracks you. We've added this edit page in case, we want this to be a collaborative effort of like, oh, there's something wrong with how this describes this thing. If you want to actually make a pull request, there's a button to help do that now. This is all just on GitHub, so this entire website. And you can see now the menu is now filtering by the published status of the documents. So all of the ones that are in various stages of review right now got hidden. And we only have the select ones that are marked as published actually showing. This is going to give us some control over what content is being shown through this from the website management aspect of things. And we're slowly just starting to put this into a place where we're actually going to be able to start referring people to this documentation. There are 40 or 50 files like this, so this is going to be something that's ongoing for a while. There's a lot of content written for a lot of them. Some of it doesn't make sense yet, which is why we kind of need the editing flow itself to help really clean that up. But lots of focus on the website. Replace this website with the new one. I guess as an update on that front, we are targeting for next week to do an update to the website. We're going to move from this model where, like right now, we have this website. All we do is update the videos. All it really is the blog and then that one brand page we published. We're going to be launching this whole site in pieces moving forward. We're going to take a more iterative approach moving forward. So that way, when one new document is available, we can push that out and really make it so that we're not like building everything up into one grand release. We just need to make sure that we're continually pushing out new chunks of this. And then, when anybody's out there looking at it, if you are like, oh, I want to know assets, and you're looking at asset stuff and how to use assets, and if you have this example and for whatever reason we don't explain something that you needed to be able to do with it, you could let us know, open a GitHub issue, do something like that, or edit the page yourself. And we can kind of all collaborate on a system that helps really make this make sense. As the people that have been primarily using it for years now, specifically this library, the core library that's now called Antelope, we probably make a lot of assumptions in our reading, and to somebody who's newer, they might not be connecting the dots the way we want them to. So we want that feedback so we can iterate on the documentation and make sure that this is something that is actually helpful to developers. So yeah, it hopefully will turn into this good collaborative experiment. Hopefully people will find these links useful and be able to share them in like Discord and Telegram and all the other places that these topics are talked about to help, educate newer developers or developers who are just getting into this stack. So it should be good. I know for years we've operated in chat rooms, and every time you answer a question, that answer just gets lost over time, and nobody uses the chat search functionality because it doesn't work well. So having kind of somewhat of institutional knowledge out on these kinds of websites will be good. And we are only going to be covering front-end development through all of the Wharf components here on this site. And there will be links from here that goes to places like the ENF's website, the documentation portal they have for smart contract development. And if there are other well-published resources out there, we are happy to link between them to create a bigger, broader experience for like the developer who's doing everything themselves. Maybe they're building the smart contract, they're deploying their own APIs, and they're building their own front end. They're going to need 3 sources of truth for that, one for each kind of specialty that they're doing. So yeah, that in a nutshell is kind of where the website is. This is probably one of the longest running milestones of this project and will continue to be, just because building a website of this magnitude it's a long-term project, and we only have a couple of us on it, like literally a couple. I think there are maybe 3 of us regularly working on this from different aspects. And then we have other developers that are more focused on individual kits and things like that. So kind of moving on to what else has been going on. This old docs repo is now archived. It is now merged into the website repo. We tried doing it as Git submodules in the beginning, and that turned out to just be kind of a pain to do deployments. So if you had previously been looking at this for any reason, it's now embedded in the website. Resource provider, I mentioned that got updated. We are looking at some potential changes to the actual Antelope library. Nothing concrete yet, but there's some difficulties with how ABIs are passed back and forth between the contract kit and the session kit, and we're not sure if the Antelope library is the solution or not. So there's some research going on. If you want to go dig around PRs and discussions and stuff, you can find more there. And I think that kind of encompasses what has happened over the last week. Question from Chad, is the website from scratch? Yes. It's designed from scratch. It's built using Svelte. We have a whole bunch of other tools in place, like we're using MDSVEX for documentation, markdown processing, and things like that. So yeah, I guess it could be considered from scratch. We're not using a CSS template or anything like that. Designers on our side built the design of the website, and then the developers have taken the design and been adopting it. So you can kind of see there's not a whole lot in terms of dependencies going on. It's mostly just processing stuff, but it is a statically built website. We're hosting it out on Cloudflare pages, and it has a bunch of continuous deployment stuff going on. So the website is the source of truth for this, and when we update it, it updates the site. As far as why, I've never heard of VitePress, but I assume it could be a decent solution. I think the reason that we veered away from it was because we needed something that was powerful enough to deal with the documentation aspects of the website. We know we wanted very specific processing of markdown files to be able to generate documentation, link it around, and do the static generation of what is starting as a single language documentation site and could potentially morph into a multilingual documentation site. But otherwise, it was just, I don't know if that's a great reason, but really early on, we decided that we were just going to build it, and we started running with it. So the actual like engineering of it really hasn't been too big of a concern or too much effort. We got like a lot of that out of the way really early on. And then it's been all like design and tweak and CSS and content since. So like I mentioned, we just added front matter to the actual documentation side of things, which if we just go look at one, did it get added to all of them? It did. There's raw. Yeah. So, I mean, that was the most advanced thing we've done in the last couple of months, I would say. Besides like all the cool stuff going on with responsiveness of the site and the design and stuff like that. I don't want to discount the actual like crafting of the HTML and the CSS that goes into it. But from an engineering perspective, we haven't had to spend too much time actually architecting the project, which I feel is what those toolkits would do for us. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, in a big picture what's going on, and I can kind of dive into the contract table stuff unless anybody has any questions about anything that's not contract kit related. Start getting my tabs ready. Cool. All right, so tables. Tables has been fun, I guess, interesting. Some some kind of semi-polite word for that the APIs are really hard to abstract. Um, there's been a bunch of PRs. If you're super interested in digging through all of it, there are like lots of discussions happening on some of these about how we're actually changing and morphing this syntax around. There is one PR that's open right now, which we're still kind of discussing. I submitted it last night after discussions earlier this week and over the weekend. We're kind of simplifying the API to the table querying language, and we have separated the responsibilities of the two elements that make up the table language. I think last week we briefly talked about tables, and then when you are doing anything asynchronously, you're going to get a cursor back that then you can interact with to fetch and load. We have separated this a little bit more, and I wonder if I actually wrote it out in a decent way in this pull request. It's either that or I did in Slack. Yeah, I must have ranted in Slack about this. So jumping back, since there's not a great leaping in point from the PR, what we've done now is that the table class is the new API. This is what we're proposing to simplify what the developers will use to query data from a smart contract table. Let me switch to query merge. So this table class is going to use the new syntax. And that's the distinction I want to make right here is that the table class, this file, when you instantiate a new table, it will be a different syntax with some shared syntax to what you'd experience if you called get table rows. But it is kind of a new paradigm on how that can be done. So this is the new world. When you get a cursor back, the table translates the new query language into the old query language. It abstracts it. It makes it so that you don't need to know the old get table rows query language to use a cursor. The table is kind of a factory that converts new language into old language. However, if you are a huge fan of the old language and you still want the benefits that the table cursor brings, you can now pass table parameters in the old syntax directly into a cursor and establish it. We've broken apart the dependency between the table and the table cursor. So now that you can use them independently, like if I go into the tests, there's a new cursor test file because you can use it independently. And you can actually create cursors manually now. This is a really advanced use case. Or I guess it's for developers that are really familiar with the code base. And maybe you've spent the last 5 years writing get table row calls. And that's what you know, and you want to stick with it. You're going to be able to use cursors to stick in that way and then still use the next and all and other things that the cursor itself will offer. It's going to be a much better experience than using get table row calls. You're going to be able to pass in types like you would in EOSIO core or the Antelope library to get typed responses. IntelliSense will work if you use the generics and you pass the types in as the type or generic parameters. I can open my IDE and show this, but there was no way to test against a generic. But in this example, we're establishing a cursor against the del band table, which is, where if you stake and you delegate bandwidth, this is where it goes. When you use a cursor and you call either next or all the row types that come back, this is an array of rows, will be typed as the delegated bandwidth type. And the IntelliSense in your IDE, like if you typed this results and accessing the first element, and then you put the dot, it will auto-complete all the fields that are available on that row type. So The generics are what provide that that automatic IntelliSense intelligent like popping up of what things are. And this type right here is what actually does the serialization of the records. I think by default, every table cursor now passes JSON false to the get table rows call. So I put a little like rant about this last week in the Wharf Telegram channel. Simply by changing the JSON to false in the query that you make, you're going to end up getting back like 4 times more rows, and the data itself is about half as big. Like this is a fairly large optimization from the client perspective and from the node operator perspective. Like I want to say get table rows on our API infrastructure is probably the #1 like request that makes it through caching, because we have layers of caching for other requests that might be really common, like get info. Get info might be more common than get table rows, but get table rows is one of the most intense API loads that we have on our infrastructure. So for it to be able to process that much more data, because it's not deserializing at the API layer, and for it to save on that bandwidth cost is going to be pretty huge for us. This type is what is handling that for us. And the generic itself is what helps you in your IDE. As a developer, if you're going to be creating this stuff manually, like you want to create a cursor manually in your application, you're going to have to manually type this stuff out, and you're going to need these definitions. And this is in the dynamic world of the contract kit. If you're in the code generated world and you are generating cursors, at build time, or it wouldn't even be at build time. It'd basically be like when you're initializing your project and you're using the code generation to say, this is my smart contract and I'm about to develop a front end against this smart contract. That's when you wouldn't need to be able to do any of this. And this will automatically be done in the generated code. So when you call my generated code dot table and you get del band, all of this will be there. Everything will be typed. And all of your IDE is going to understand what those types are and be able to do that auto completion, show you type hints, show you what variables are needed. And when you're querying a table, for example, it'll show you like the keys that you could query against, that sort of thing. I know I kind of got down a little bit of a rabbit hole here with table cursors. So I'm going to walk this back. Table cursors, again, are where you're going to be able to use this old world code and pass in the actual params. You can see we're doing scope down here. You can use typed or strings. We're using lower bound and upper bound in cursors now instead of from and to. Again, it's all the old syntax. And you can see there's a ton of code examples where we're catching edge cases about how this does and doesn't work. And then all the old tests for backwards compatibility. We'll probably remove these at some point, but. So the table now is all of the new syntax. And the table can return a cursor for you, but it's not going to be typed in the dynamic world, unfortunately, unless you type it yourself, which I think we have an example of. These are all. Yeah. So that same generic typing can work if you're using the new syntax world. But you just have to, when you're instantiating the table, again, use a generic and pass in the type, like the struct. And I could, once again, this is something that the generated code version will do for you. But if you are working in a dynamic world, maybe you're building a block explorer and you need to do, well, no, that wouldn't work either. If you can embed the structs in your code manually, it'll work. If you cannot, it's just going to be any, basically. So, and then there was one test I was looking for. I look for row type. That is the only test. I guess that's the one I was looking for. Either way, that's been a big move forward, is to get these generics actually working. The code generated stuff is something we're shifting our focus back to now, because we're pretty happy with where the actual tables are in construction, like in the building of things. And the new developer experience for like the documentation and the direction we're going with that, we're going to push people to actually use tables themselves. The language itself is a little bit, we think, easier to use. And if you have feedback on that, we're very much welcome to. Everything's optional. So you can call a query without any parameters against a table instance, and it will create all the defaults based on what it knows of the contract and let you query. I actually, and maybe this is a good example to kind of highlight this. I think it's the get call. Yeah. So I was working on a test script the other day just to, to run it through its paces. And whenever you're using something theoretical in a practical application, you always run into these things. And actually, this is what I was doing. I was querying the global table. And using the contract kit, it's still way better than if you're using get table rows. Like it is, if you were using the get table rows call directly, you'd be specifying the contract, the table, potentially the scope. We're not using scope in this sense, but maybe we'd need to automatically default the scope of it or something. You'd be setting limit of 1. You'd be destructuring the row of stuff that's coming back, yada, yada. This is what in the application I had to do previously to fetch the first row of the global table. If you know anything about the global table, it's a table with a single row in it. And it is kind of the global state that continuously gets updated with parameters. Like it has the total number of votes that are happening and the amount of BP rewards that are floating around. And there's just a bunch of like system state that exists here. With the way that the syntax worked a couple days ago, you had to call table first and next just to get the first row if you didn't want to provide any query parameters. If you were querying directly against something that you'd be using a lower and upper bound, you would be able to use the get call. But the idea that came out of it was that what if you could just call get on a table and it would just give you the first row? Because that's what we need out of this global table. There's no reason to query it any further than this. So this is actually the syntax that now exists. You could chain this together into a one-liner if you really wanted to get that one row. But now you can call get without a query parameter, and it will assemble kind of the most generic. It'll translate it into the most generic possible get table rows call and return the first row. So if you have a table that just has state in it with the one row, you can just call get now. These are the sort of optimizations that we want to be able to find and expose and make available, like to make working with table data that much easier. So yeah, that lots of little advancements like this are coming through. And I showed this one, I think primarily is because we're almost at a point where we want other people to start using this API to query your tables. Like I want to see and be able to show examples to the team of what other people are doing with tables. So that way we can write unit tests. We can look at what the syntax is to successfully, do the operation that it is that you need to be able to do with the table, and then figure out how we can make that better, shorter, more understandable, and less of a pain, because the table API is just kind of a pain to work with in general. So the goal of the contract kit, one of the goals, is to really ease that adoption curve when it comes to dealing with tables. And this is a bit of a tangent, but the way that we are now splitting these things out with cursors, we anticipate that since the table is now a translation layer that converts into the API query language, that if and when we have a new API that we can access, we will be able to work on the conversion of the table itself to use the new query language in an alternative form of cursor, which means that people building applications can still use this kind of pseudo language on top of tables and then access the data itself through multiple physical API endpoints. So yeah, that's a very long way of showing where the tables are at. This is all published now, I think, as 2.1. I don't know if I'd still recommend building an application around it, but it's definitely worth maybe checking out and trying. That's what we have started doing over the past couple days, actually, is including the contract kit in some of our projects and starting to remove the code that was there to access tables and create actions and use the contract kit for it. And that sort of stuff is providing a lot of really good use cases. Again, sort of like this Git call that I was just showing the change to really improve that developer experience, which this is kind of all about. The session kit's all about user experience and a little bit of developer experience. And the contract kit is really all about developer experience, making it so that it's not rocket science and you're not manually dealing with fetch and having to know the exact syntax you need to pass in to a specific API endpoint to get the data you need. Like, it's just, we need to move past that. So the contract kit, I want to say we will have a more stable release soon. I can't even pretend to put a 1.0 mark on this yet. We will know a little bit better about what that 1.0 looks like once the code generation is further along, because primarily that's what we want people to use. Manually instantiating tables and actions and contracts and kind of working in the dynamic mode is the advanced use case of the contract kit, which we want to absolutely make sure is supported, and it's the foundation of the code generation. But yeah, but once the code generation is in a better place and is actually generating code based on these new APIs, we will start targeting a more general approach, like the general public, to start using this even more and more. But if you want to start using it for table queries and help evolve that language, you are more than welcome to. And feel free to leave questions in the WharfKit Telegram chat or use the good old discussion board here on GitHub, which is actually on the root project. I know we don't use it much yet, but I think long-term having these sorts of discussions someplace where Google can index it will be very beneficial to the entire Antelope ecosystem, because that way you can just use Google to find information instead of being forced into chat rooms to ask the same question somebody asked last week. I think that's about all I have got in terms of updates. So I guess in questions, which we have kind of a smaller crew today, we can kind of roll it out there and finish off. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for joining today, and we will be in Telegram like normal. So let us know what you think, and we will definitely keep pushing on this and have some news soon for when the code generation portion of it is ready to be tested against your contracts, because I'm sure at least one of your contracts is going to break it. So